in the United States have either moderate or severe dental fluorosis. So that trade-off between lowering tooth decay and producing dental fluorosis but holding it only to 10% clearly was a failure. We have 4 times more dental fluorosis as intended and as desired. Our attitude is that when you see this dental fluorosis, it means the child has been overexposed to fluoride, and the question is what other tissues have bone affected. So let's start with the bone, because the teeth are a window into the bone. In fact, the teeth actually grow out of the jawbone, and by the time the permanent teeth have come out, the jawbone has been loaded up with fluoride. And so if you can see the damage to the growing tooth cells, what did the fluoride do to the growing bone cells during this 8, 9, 10 period? In fact, the first study that was published on this in '55 indicated that the children in the fluoridated community, which was Newburgh, New York, had twice as much cortical bone defects as the children in the non-fluoridated community. Now, the cortical bone is the outside layer of the bone, and that's the layer, it's a lamellar structure, and that part of the bone is meant to protect against fractures. And so the concern then is whether we're increasing bone fractures in children. Well, we had to wait until 2001 before someone investigated this, and the researchers in Mexico found a linear correlation as the severity of dental fluorosis went up, meaning the amount of fluoride the child had been exposed to before the permanent teeth had erupted. As that went up, so did bone fractures in the children. And it was quite striking. When you go from no dental fluorosis to very mild dental fluorosis, it doubled. The bone fractures doubled. Very mild to mild, doubled again. Mild to moderate, doubled again. The next concern about bone is that the first symptoms of bone poisoning in an adult are just like arthritis, stiff joints, pains in the joints, pains in the bone. In the United States, we have 1 in 3 adults now with some form of arthritis. And if you ask a doctor what's causing it, they will say, well, we don't really know, but we think it's got something to do with aging. Well, what also parallels aging, of course, is the number of years you spent in a fluoridated community, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, eventually 60, 70, and so on. The next concern is as the fluoride continues to build up in the bone, and I should say that up to 50% of all the fluoride that we take in each day accumulates in the bone. The fluoride is bioaccumulative. The bones get more brittle. And another major concern is increased hip fractures in adults. A studies done in China, as documented in this National Research Council report, and we've further elaborated in our book, The Case Against Fluoride, indicates that levels as low as 3 milligrams per day, that's 3 liters of fluoridated water per day, may increase hip fractures in the elderly. Now, my major concern is not the bones, although I think that's significant. My major concern is the brain, because when the baby is born, the blood-brain barrier is not fully formed. We think the blood-brain barrier keeps fluoride out of the brain most of the time, but for the first half year of the baby's life, the fluoride can get into the brain. And this is not the time, in my view, and the view of many other scientists, that a baby should be exposed to fluoride at 250 times the level in mother's milk. There have now been over 100 animal studies which shows that fluoride damages the brain. There have also been 23 IQ studies, most of them from China, but 1 from India, 1 from Iran, and 1 from Mexico, which show an association between moderate exposure to fluoride and lowered IQ in children. And I actually visited the villages where one of these studies was done. It was a very good study. They controlled for lead, they controlled for iodine. Most of the villages were almost the 2 villages were almost identical, except for the fact that their well water was different. And the author of this study estimated that the IQ would be lowered at 1.9 parts per million. And that offers no adequate margin of safety for children drinking water at 1 parts per million when you consider the massive range of sensitivity to any toxic effect, and the fact that once you put fluoride in the water, you can't control the dose. Another concern, which many of us have had for many years, is fluoride's impact on the thyroid gland. For between the 30s and the 50s, doctors in Argentina, France, and Germany were giving patients with hyperthyroidism, overactive thyroid gland, sodium fluoride tablets to lower thyroid function. And the doses that they were using were between 2.5 and 4.5 milligrams per day, which is exceeded by many people drinking fluoridated water. For example, the Institute of Medicine actually advises people to drink 3 liters of water a day. So clearly then they would be in the range for lowered thyroid function. And once again, as in many of these other issues, the fluoridating countries, including the United States, are simply not doing the studies. They're not investigating to see if there's a relationship between fluoridation and lowered IQ, fluoridation and arthritis, fluoridation and hypothyroidism. Key health studies have not been done in fluoridated countries. If you don't look, you don't find. They would like to imply, because they don't see anything, there's nothing wrong. But if they're not looking, they won't find. You often hear the promoters say things like, oh, we've been doing this for 60 years, and if there's any problem, we would know about it by now. Oh, no, you wouldn't, unless you were doing the studies. Another issue that came out in 1997 was a researcher in England found that fluoride accumulated in the human pineal gland. And the pineal gland is a little gland between the 2 parts of the brain, the 2 hemispheres of the brain. It's not protected by the blood-brain barrier. It has a high perfusion rate of blood, and it also is a calcifying tissue like the teeth and the bones. And so this researcher hypothesized that fluoride would be attracted to this tissue, this little gland, like a magnet. And sure enough, when she investigated, the average level of fluoride on these little calcium hydroxyapatite crystals was 9,000 parts per million, up to 21,000 parts per million, which means that this little gland has a higher concentration of fluoride than any other tissue in the body, including the bone. This researcher, Jennifer Luke, also did animal studies, and in the animal studies, she found that fluoride lowered the production of melatonin, the hormone that this little gland makes, and incidentally, it only makes it at night, the hormone of darkness. This pineal gland reacts to light. Descartes called it the seat of the soul. Not only did it lower melatonin levels in these animals, but also shorten the time to puberty, which is absolutely consistent. Melatonin is thought to act like a biological clock, involved with timing of puberty, timing of aging, timing of jet lag and sleeping patterns and so on. Controls all kinds of things. And what they think happens that with the child, at birth, the melatonin levels are high, and with childhood, they gradually lower, and at a certain point, the lowered melatonin levels trigger the production of the sex hormones, leading to puberty. Ironically, that first study that was published, which I already referred to in the bones, also recorded that the young girls in the fluoridated community, Newburgh, were menstruating on average 5 months earlier than the young girls in the non-fluoridated community. Now, they didn't think that was significant at the time. Now, with Jennifer Luke's work, it is clearly takes on a new perspective. Kids now are reaching puberty 7, 8, 9. It has people very, very worried. But once again, the fluoridating countries have made absolutely no effort to reproduce Jennifer Luke's work. And it's not difficult. They could have done it easily. The Department of Health and Human Services has adopted to this, quote, sacred policy of fluoridation is to deny, critique the methodologies, but don't attempt to reproduce the studies. If you don't look, you don't find. And they're using the absence of study as if it was the same as the absence of harm, which is absolutely ridiculous utterly irresponsible. So now they're giving every indication, particularly the Center of Disease Control that avidly promotes fluoridation around the United States, and around the world for that matter. The impression that they give is that it's more important now to protect this practice than to protect the health of the American people and our babies and our children. It's almost as if the teeth have become the most important tissue, the most important organ in the body, instead of our brains, instead of our thyroid glands, instead of our pineal glands, instead of our kidneys.
There you go. So you can search on Prison Planet TV or on YouTube for the other Dr. Condit interviews and videos that we shot with him, and get them out to people you know, because it is time that we stop fluoridating our water. This is an arcane practice. This is like leaching and bloodletting. And we still do it, and we still promote it, and we let people promote it and put it in our water, and they use our tax money to do it. So let's stop it. Or let's at least get a hardcore scientific review of this practice, because it needs to stop. Moving on, Europe, are you ready for a bank holiday? We got Bilderberg members and former Bilderberg members calling for a bank holiday. In an article for the Financial Times entitled, "We Must Break Up the Failing Euro," former Bilderberg attendee Sir Martin Jacob concedes that all efforts to rescue the euro have been in vain, calling for all 17 members to decide at once to revert to national currencies. And that's in an article by Paul Joseph Watson called "5-Day Bank Holiday to Prepare for Collapse of Euro." Jacob is a former chairman of the Canary Wharf Group and argues that a 5-day bank holiday should be imposed to allow financial markets to absorb the shock of the collapse of the euro. So they're calling for it. The elites have said it's going to happen. Experience shows, he goes on, experience shows that currency breakups like devaluations have to be handled as to avoid anticipatory speculative activity. The essential requirement is a single unequivocal decision to revert to national currencies, reached confidently by all 17 governments and announced without prior notice, he writes. That's why you got people in Greece pulling their money out, because they know what's going on. And you remember, we covered this in Aaron's piece yesterday and in Police State for the Rise of FEMA, that Etienne Davignon, the Bilderberg chairman, said back in, I think it was the late 90s or early 2000s, that back in the early 90s, they came up with the plan for the euro. And now they came up with the plan to destroy the euro. And they brought the euro together to bring all the European nations so they could control them all at once, with different ways of controlling the currency, putting in different laws, and these are all unelected members. They're all appointed by these various weird technocratic groups. Anyway, it goes on. Bilderberg chairman Etienne Davignon bragged that Bilderberg helped create the euro by first introducing the policy agenda for a single currency back in the early 90s, which was later formalized into the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. So you can read more about that in Paul Joseph Watson's article.